The first setting we'll be taking a look at is FXAA. FXAA is one of the two anti-aliasing options that we get in this game. The anti-aliasing options help smooth out jagged edges around different objects in the game. So that could either be our own character that we're running around with, or it could be the leaves on the different trees out in the distance. I have tested this setting both in 4K, 1440p and 1080p because the recommendation will differentiate depending on the resolution you're playing in. Normally FXAA is the lowest amount of anti-aliasing you can enable, which is also showcased through the negligible performance and quality difference that you get from having it either turned off or on. No matter what resolution we're playing in, I don't really notice any difference. Therefore, I would just recommend to turn this off and instead use MSAA, which we're going to take a look at next. Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my video. Today we are once again taking a look at GTA 5, where we'll take a look at all the different settings, how they compare in terms of FPS and fidelity, and lastly I'll show my own optimized settings that I recommend. If you have any suggestions for future games you would like for me to analyze, feel free to write them in the comments below. Firstly, I wanted to showcase the two extremes of all low and all ultra, to see both the performance and the quality difference between the two. There's a few points I want to mention before we move on to the next setting. Firstly, GTA 5 is very dependent on your CPU, and especially on single core performance, since it is an older DirectX 11 title. Therefore, you might experience a CPU bottleneck while playing, especially in multiplayer, so that is something you should be aware of. Secondly, the game generally does not use that much RAM, which is really great. However, if you turn up the settings, you will be able to use a lot of VRAM, which is also something you should be aware of. As you can see in the video, we have a 74% difference between all low and all ultra, so we have a lot of performance headroom we can work with. So let's get started. The next setting we'll be taking a look at is MSAA. MSAA is another anti-aliasing option you can use inside this game. Like with FXAA, MSAA will smooth out jagged edges in the game and generally make the image look a lot sharper. Like with FXAA, I have tested this both in 4K, 1440p and 1080p. Unlike FXAA, MSAA has a massive performance difference between having it turned off and all the way up to 8x, where we lose around 50% of our performance. However, MSAA does also actually make a difference in terms of quality, where you can see a noticeable difference. Maybe not so much in the 4K, but when we later take a look at 1080p, you'll definitely be able to see a difference. For 4K, I would recommend to use 2x, because we do have a little bit of shimmering around Michael's head and body, which will go away if you enable 2x instead of having it turned off. If we then take a look at 1440p, I would actually recommend using 2x again, because at off we do have some shimmering, which seems to mostly be turned off by enabling 2x MSAA. You could also go up to 4x, but that's gonna be up to yourself. I recommend to at least use 2x. And if we lastly take a look at 1080p, you can see that we have a lot of shimmering around Michael when we had this turned off. Here I would actually recommend going all the way up to 4x to completely remove all of this shimmering and make the image look a lot better. That will also take around 30% of your performance, which is quite a lot. But then again, it will also make the game look a lot better and make it a lot more playable. It is also worth mentioning that MSAA will also change your VRAM usage. It actually has a profound effect on your VRAM usage, especially between 4x and 8x. As you can see, up to 4x we use around 14-15% extra VRAM, which is not too bad. But as soon as we turn it up to 8x, we use around 30-32% extra VRAM. Now let's take a look at NVIDIA TXAA. NVIDIA TXAA is the last anti-aliasing option we have in this game. It is exclusive to NVIDIA graphics cards, so if you do not have an NVIDIA graphics card, you can just skip this section. In my testing, I have again chosen to test both in 4K, 1440p and 1080p. And for my testing methodology, I have chosen to test it against 8x MSAA. Because to enable NVIDIA TXAA, you need to have MSAA enabled as well, at least on 2x. But you cannot enable NVIDIA TXAA if you have MSAA on 8x. That is a lot of abbreviations. I hope that makes sense. As you can see in my testing, I gained quite a lot performance because I actually gained the performance difference that I saw earlier between 8x MSA and 4x MSAA, which basically means that NVIDIA TXAA does not hurt your performance at all. So whether you have it enabled or not will have no impact on your performance. Therefore, I would highly recommend to use this setting if you can. And I would highly recommend to use it in conjunction with the recommendation I gave in the previous section around MSAA. So if I've recommended for you to use 2x MSAA, I would recommend to also enable TXAA, and the same for 4x. Moving away from all the anti-aliasing settings, we got population density. Population density determines how many NPCs are in the game, basically. So how many people do you see walking down the sidewalk? How many are driving around in cars inside the city and outside the city? All in all, this setting makes the game feel a lot more alive and makes it feel like you are actually driving in a big city. This has a very small impact on your performance with maximum of 3%. Therefore, I would highly recommend to set this to 100 because otherwise the city can feel a bit empty and less realistic. Now let's take a look at population variety. Population variety determines the variety in the different NPCs in the game. So the variety in the different kinds of clothes they'll be wearing, in the different kind of NPCs you'll be able to see, and so on. I haven't been able to fully confirm whether or not this will also affect the variety in the different cars you see NPCs driving around, so I'm not quite sure on that. In my testing, I didn't find any performance difference between having this at the lowest at 0% or at the highest at 100%. Therefore, since it doesn't hurt your performance or even your VRAM usage, I will recommend to just leave this at 100%. Next up, we got distance scaling. Distance scaling determines the amount of detail that can be rendered at one time. So distance scaling won't affect whether or not you're able to see a building, but it can affect the level of detail that building will be in once you see it. In my testing, however, I did not notice any difference with any objects, buildings, and so on out in the distance, whether I had it at 0% or had it at 100%. We do, however, lose a small amount of performance, around 3 to maybe 4% performance. Therefore, I would recommend to just leave this at 0% since I didn't notice any difference in terms of quality. Next up, we got texture quality. Texture quality determines the quality of certain objects in the game. In my example, you can see the picture hanging on the wall is a lot sharper and generally better looking at very high, comparatively to either high or normal. This setting has no impact on your performance in game, however it does have an impact on your VRAM usage. So between normal and very high, you'll use around 20% extra VRAM. Therefore, I would recommend that you set this setting based on the amount of VRAM you have available. So if you have enough VRAM available, then I would highly recommend to use very high because it is, without a doubt, the best looking option. Now let's take a look at shader quality. Shader quality will primarily affect the lighting or the quality of the lighting inside the game. The biggest and the best example of this is either at a sunset or a sunrise, where you can see here there's a massive difference, especially between normal and high in terms of the quality. However, this is only at certain times of the day where you might actually see that difference. So most of the time you're playing, that won't make that much of a difference. In my second example here, I have also seen it make certain shadows seem a bit darker, but that is very difficult to showcase in a video. Lastly, it also seems to have a slight effect on parallax mapping, which means that it will have a slight effect on the realism of certain dirt roads, where you can see we get a bit more detail once we turn up this setting. It's not much, but you can definitely see that there is a difference. Shader quality therefore does not make the biggest changes in the game. Therefore, for this setting I would recommend to just set this at normal, because you're not really gonna notice the difference when you're just playing the game. Next up we got shadow quality. Shadow quality determines the quality of all the different shadows inside the game. You can see that there is quite a big difference between having this on normal and having it on high. While we have it on high, we can actually make out the individual leaves on the palm tree. Between high and very high, we do also have some slightly extra details added to the shadows, but it's not as big as a change as going from normal to high. The peculiar thing is that between normal and high, we don't actually lose any performance, even though the shadows definitely look a lot better. However, between high and very high, or between normal and very high, we lose a lot of performance. And I also noticed that I started to use some extra VRAM once I turned it up to very high, which I did not notice with high. Therefore, I would recommend to leave this at high, since it adds some extra quality without hurting your performance. Now let's take a look at reflection quality. Reflection quality will control the quality of all the different reflections inside the game. So this can be the reflections coming from different store windows inside the game, or from your shiny new car. This has a big impact on the quality of GTA, because you have so many store windows inside the cities, and you have so many shiny cars that will reflect all the different objects around them. In my testing, however, even though you can see that there is a quite big quality difference between the different settings, and it does slowly get better and better looking, it's not until we hit Ultra that we actually lose any performance from turning this up. Which is actually quite good, because that means that I can safely recommend to leave this at very high, because it doesn't hurt your performance. Next up, we got Reflection MSAA. Reflection MSAA is another anti-aliasing setting inside this game. However, this one will only affect the reflections inside the game. In theory, this works like any other anti-aliasing setting, where it will remove the jagged edges as you go higher up in the option, and generally make the game look a lot better. In my testing, however, where I tried to test this in both in 4K, 1440p and 1080p, I could not find any noticeable difference between having this turned off or having it turned all the way up to 8x. Therefore, I would recommend to simply leave this off. Now let's take a look at water quality. Water quality actually does not affect the quality of the water that much, in the sense of the amount of waves or the way the water actually looks. It more so affects the screen space reflection on top of the water. So as you can see here in my example, the pier out in the distance becomes a lot more detailed when it's reflected into the water, the higher we go into this option. It seems like high and very high are more or less the same, both in terms of performance but also in terms of quality. It is also worth mentioning that this will also have an effect when it's been raining. So if you're driving around the city where after it's been raining, you'll see there's water puddles everywhere. And those water puddles will also be affected by this setting, depending on the amount of detail there will be in those screen space reflections on the water puddles. For my recommendation, I would recommend that you use either high or very high if you're playing single player, because this can really make the game look absolutely stunning when it's raining. However, if you are playing multiplayer, I would rather recommend that you use normal, so you can gain those extra 10% of performance. Next up, we got particles quality. Particles quality controls the quality of different particles inside the game. So that can be the quality of the rain, the snow, the fog, the different smoke effects in the game, either from you burning your tires, from a fire, from you shooting your gun. All of those are all affected by particles quality. In my first example here, I have tried to compare the quality of the rain between normal and very high. However, in my testing, I really didn't see any noticeable difference, both in terms of performance, but also in terms of the quality. In my second example, I tried to burn out my tires to create some smoke to be able to see any difference. Even though we here do find a minor performance difference, I still can't see any noticeable quality difference between the three different options. Therefore, I would recommend to just leave this at normal. Now let's take a look at grass quality. Grass quality controls both the density and the quality of the grass inside the game. Between normal and ultra, we have an almost 25% performance difference, which is quite large. Which is also why you will experience massive frame drops once you go outside the city, where there's a lot of grass and foliage. For this setting, I would recommend to use high, because normal basically turns off all the grass, making the game look very bland and very ugly. And between high and ultra, there's not that much of a difference in terms of quality, even though there is quite a large difference in terms of performance. Now let's take a look at soft shadows. Soft shadows will soften up the shadows inside the game to make them look less harsh. Between sharp, soft and softer, that's not that much of a difference, both in terms of performance but also in terms of quality. It's not until we actually hit softest that we actually start seeing the shadows becoming more soft or softer. If you then compare that to the AMD and Nvidia specific one, you can here see that the Nvidia one is definitely the one that is the best looking in terms of its softening up the shadows. However, it is also the one of the two that has the biggest performance hit. It's hard to comment on the AMD one because this was tested on an Nvidia graphics card, so it might look better on an AMD card and it might perform better on an AMD card. No matter what you choose, either softest, the AMD specific one or the Nvidia specific one, this will have a fairly large impact on your performance. And some people might even prefer to have their shadows seem very sharp. Therefore, for my recommendation, I would actually recommend to just leave this at sharp, because if you don't mind having the shadows a little bit sharper, it will save you a lot of performance. Next up, we got PostFX. PostFX, or as it's more commonly known in other games, post-processing, affects several items inside this game. Firstly, it will generally just affect the bloom of the game, so the lighting and the guardrails inside this game, which is most noticeable either when it's very foggy or when you have a sunrise or a sunset. Secondly, it will affect the other settings, so that will be motion blur, depth of field and HDR. I don't have an HDR cable monitor, so I can't test that, but the way it affects motion blur, first of all, is that you need to have PostFX on a minimum of high, otherwise you won't be able to use motion blur. And the same goes with depth of field, where you need to have PostFX actually on very high to be able to use depth of field. Therefore, this is very important to keep in mind if you want to use either motion blur or depth of field. In my first example here, it's very difficult, and was also very difficult for myself, to find any noticeable quality difference, even though we can see there clearly is something happening in the background with our performance difference. If we then go over to my second example, again with a sunrise or sunset, you can see that there's a clear difference in quality between the four different options. Therefore, I would recommend to use high for PostFX, because with high, you still have some bloom, you still have some guardrails enabled, and it will still make the sunset, sunrise, and other foggy parts of the world look a lot better, without hurting your performance too much, where you're looking at maybe 2 to maximum of 5% at those very specific scenarios. Now let's take a look at motion blur strength. Motion blur strength determines the strength of the motion blur in-game. And the motion blur in-game will add some extra blurriness to the screen while you're moving your camera around. This is most noticeable while you're aiming down your sights. You can see here in my example that it can make a dramatic difference in the way the rest of the world looks while you're aiming down your sight. If I try to freeze a frame here, you can more easily see the difference between the three different options I have chosen to test. In my testing, I surprisingly did not find any noticeable performance difference. Therefore, this is more of a personal preference, whether you like to use motion blur or not. Personally, I don't like it, so I would recommend to just leave this at 0%. Next up, we got depth of field. Depth of field will slightly blur out everything else except the very thing you're either looking at or aiming at. As you can see here in my example, in both of while I have it off and on, I'm aiming directly at the gate in front of me. But if you notice the rooftops on the house a little bit further back, while we have it enabled, they start to be very blurry, and also the trees further out in the distance compared to while I have it off, where I can still see them very clearly. In my testing, I found next to no performance difference between having this turned off and having it turned on. However, I do have to mention again that you need to have PostFX on very high to even be able to use depth of field. So it does kinda inadvertently come with a performance cost because of that. Therefore, this is more of a personal preference, whether you like it or not. Personally, I don't really like it that much in GTA, so I would just recommend to leave this off. Also, because that means that we can leave PostFX at high instead of very high. Next up, we got anisotropic filtering. Anisotropic filtering will add some extra sharpness to textures that are either viewed at a distance or at an angle. In GTA, this is very noticeable with the different roads in and outside the city. So while you're driving around, you'll definitely be able to see a difference depending on the option you have chosen inside this setting. As you can see with my example here, as we go higher into the option all the way up to 16x, the bricks in front of me start to get more and more detailed, and we lose all the blurriness that they have while we have it on the lower options. This has a very small impact on your performance, and since this is something you're gonna notice and you're gonna experience every time you drive around the city, I would highly recommend to leave this at 16x. Now let's take a look at ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion adds some extra shadows into crevices inside the game. Normally this is most noticeable with the trees, with the different branches and leaves of trees, where you'll be able to see that they get some extra shadows and some extra depth to them. However, in GTA I couldn't actually find any place generally in the game where I could see any noticeable difference between having ambient occlusion off and having it all the way up to high. Therefore, together with the 3 to 4% performance difference, I would recommend to simply just leave this off. Next up, let's take a look at tessellation. Tessellation adds some extra geometrical details to the trees inside the game. As you can see here in my first example, or it might be a bit difficult to see, once we go from off to normal, the tree gets a little bit extra curvy. It's not much, it's a very minor difference, but it is definitely there. Between normal and very high, there really isn't any noticeable difference, and the performance more or less speaks the same, where we have the same performance across all the options. If we then take a look at a maybe better example at the palm trees that's actually located inside the main city, you can see there's clear difference between having this on off or having it on normal. However, again, after we hit normal, there doesn't seem to be any reason to go any higher. Therefore, I would recommend to just leave tessellation at normal. Now let's take a look at the first advanced graphic, which is long shadows. Long shadows is supposed to add some extra shadows from either buildings or mountains that are further out in the distance, but should be especially noticeable either at dusk or at dawn. From my testing, however, I have not been able to find a single location where I could see any noticeable difference in quality between having this off and having this on. Therefore, I would simply recommend to leave this off because it's not going to make any noticeable graphical difference. Next up, we got high resolution shadows. High resolution shadows does exactly what the name tells you. It will use some higher resolution for the shadows in-game, making them look a bit sharper. In my testing, I found this has a very minimal difference on your quality of the game. It's something you actually have to look for to actually see the difference between having this off and having it on. Therefore, I would also just recommend to leave this off because I would highly doubt that you're going to notice any difference. And that does mean that you can save the 3% of FPS and also save around 4% of your VRAM usage. Now let's take a look at high detail streaming while flying. High detail streaming while flying should in theory add some extra details while you're flying in the game. So this will only affect your game while you're flying. In my testing, both this time and the last time I made a video on GTA, I have not been able to find any noticeable graphical difference having this either enabled or disabled. And all the other sources I've looked at tells more or less the same story. Therefore, I would simply recommend to leave this off. Next up, we got extended distance scaling. Extended distance scaling will extend the distance at which textures are loaded in. So you can see here in my example, while we have this at 0%, the building is not loaded in more than you can just see that there is a building. As we go higher, we add more and more details to the building, making it look a lot better. This will also have an impact while you're flying, where this will be able to remove a lot of the pop-ins you will experience. Not all of them, but it will definitely help a lot to minimize the amount of pop-ins you will experience while flying in the game. Last time I tested this, I did test it while flying, where I found an up to 6% performance difference between 0% and 100%. And even at that 6% performance difference, I will still say that it's worth going for the 100%, because this can make a big difference in the quality while you're playing this game, both in terms of while you're just running around in the city where you'll be able to see some extra details, but especially while you're driving really fast or flying around, where you'll be able to remove a lot of those annoying pop-ins. And now we have the final setting, extended shadow distance. Extended shadow distance will add some extra details to the shadows in game. From my testing, this has no impact on your performance whatsoever, so this should be an easy recommendation to set this at 100%. However, this is reliant on you having set shadow quality to very high. If you have it set to anything below very high, you won't even be able to use this setting. In my recommendation for shadow quality, I actually recommended it to set it to high because of the rather big performance difference between high and very high. Therefore, my recommendation for this setting is that if you have set your shadow quality high, then you can just leave it alone, you can't change it anyways. But if you have set your shadow quality to very high, then I also highly recommend to set this to 100% because it will add some extra details to the shadows without making you lose any more performance. Here are my own recommended settings, which are based off the recommendations I've made throughout the video. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, you have to select your anti-aliasing settings based off your resolution. So if you're playing in 1080p, I recommend a minimum of 4x MSAA. If you're playing in 1440p, I recommend a minimum of 2x MSAA. And if you're playing in 4K, I also recommend 2x MSAA. Furthermore, you should also select the texture quality based on the amount of VRAM you have, since this setting will have a big impact on your VRAM usage. And here is the live showcase of my recommended settings stacked up against all low and all ultra. As you can see, we have almost the same quality as all ultra, while having almost 70% more FPS. We're also using 55% less VRAM compared to our ultra, which is just great. But thank you all for watching. If you made this far and been able to use this video to get better FPS in GTA 5, please like and subscribe for future videos where we'll take a look at other games. If you have any feedback on the videos or any other tips or tricks to get more FPS in GTA 5, please by all means share them in the comments below. If you're interested in these kinds of videos, maybe check out the video I made on Rust. Have a nice day. Bye bye.